So we are now, at least on my clock, just about 5 o'clock. So thanks to all of you who have logged in again. The numbers of this have been great, and it's really encouraging to see so many people sort of getting involved in these webinars and sort of enjoying them. So today's one is on training zones and a little bit on threshold training. And when I wrote this, when I put this webinar up, I was going to talk a lot more about threshold training, and as I've started to go through and build the presentation, there's so many questions we can raise around training zones and the concept of training zones. What I didn't want to do is cover it in such little depth that you just got like a top 5 tips of this or that, and you could have just got that off a little Google search. So I spent a bit more time on training zones, and it's meant that what I was going to talk about in terms of threshold training has been a little bit squeezed. So what I've done instead is set up a new webinar on the 20th of May where I'll go into threshold training in a lot more depth. Positives, negatives, ways to do it, ways that you might not do it, people who support it, coaches who have made it work, people who really don't think it's a good idea. So we could kind of have that broader discussion around threshold training. But it is intrinsically linked to the concept of training zones, which is the reason why I've called it both. So I've touched on it very briefly here. But mostly today is going to be on training zones, and that makes sense to do that before delving into threshold, because threshold's a little bit more specific. So a bit higher level, and then we're going to go in a little bit more specific. So I hope that's okay with you guys. I know some people have come on specifically for the threshold stuff, but it's kind of the two things are linked, so you can't really abstract one from the other. As ever with these presentations, I'm supported by somebody who's massively more qualified and experienced than myself, which is always very humbling. And today it's just sort of Olympian top coach and just general top human being, Helen Clitheroe, who is looking after the sort of chat with you guys. I won't chat about myself. So before we start this presentation, what I want to do, and I know it sounds really corny, but I want it to leave you with more questions than I answer. And I know that's kind of backwards. You probably come on here for more answers than questions. The reality is I'm trying to get across with these webinars that coaching is an art as much as it is a science. And if you look for kind of cookie cutter approaches to working with athletes or coaching yourself, as an athlete, you're probably cutting off a load of different avenues of ways you could really shape things and tailor things specifically to you. So the reality is I'm going to talk through training zones, absolutely, the basics of it, but I'm also going to challenge some of those basics and challenge the concept in general. The way that you'll answer the questions that I raise, sure, you can get in touch with me and ask them. You can read more books. You can speak to other coaches or athletes. But the way you'll really answer those questions is by speaking to the athletes you coach. And however corny that sounds, the reality is your individual context as an athlete yourself, or the individual context of the athletes you coach, is what makes whether you would use training zones work or not. Some people you will do, some people you won't. Some athletes I coach, I have more of a zone approach. Some people I don't. It depends on them, their psychology, what makes them tick, and what's going to work for them. I'm biased. I say this pretty much every webinar. I have my own biases because I've been coaching for 10 years, and I have ways that I think have worked for me, but they are biases. It's not right and wrong. I've got my issues with zone training, but there are people who have had fantastic success using training zones and the concept of training zones. So please just sort of recognize that. You'll pick up my biases as ever as we go through it. What I want you to do is think kind of critically here. Like, this is not, and so just going, this is the right way to do things, this is the wrong way to do things, kind of go, actually, it's probably a bit of this, or I can shape that, to make it work for me. So it is complex. You will likely disagree with me at times, and that's great. Remember to label your questions as blue so we can pick them up, and the video will be available after. Don't let your brain be fried by the next slide, please. I have been asked, I'm going to leave it on the screen for just a second so you can read it afterwards. I have been asked to provide obviously references so people can kind of go and do further reading. Now, look, this isn't an academic presentation, so I've not referenced it kind of in detail as I go through. So treat this more as a reading list. They are generally journals. Sign up to ResearchGate and you will be able to download pretty much all of those. But some of them, if you just Google them, you'll find the papers. They're not that complicated. This is endurance sport. It isn't that complicated. Most of these you'll understand, and they're well worth a read through. So let's get stuck into it. Training zones. Or the concept of training zones is basically the idea of splitting training into sort of distinct groups or subsections or zones, or like imagine a series of buckets that we're going to kind of drop different training intensities into. And we can do that by a range of different ways. We can do it by pace, we can do it by intensity, we can do it, I've put their output, pace is technically an output. We can do it by like power on the bike or whatever. So there's different ways that we can construct those zones around different measures, but essentially training zones are taking your training and splitting it up into these different kind of distinct blocks. And there's a built-in assumption with that, and the purpose for doing that is that there's something kind of meaningfully different happening in a physiological way with your training that might happen in one zone compared to another, because otherwise what's the point in splitting them up into zones? So we're kind of working, there is this like built-in assumption that if you say do a run that is primarily in zone 1, something physiologically quite different is happening than if you do a run with effort in zone 3 or zone 4 or whatever it is. Now, I appreciate for some of you zones will be completely new. This will start to become clearer as we move through. But that's a kind of overriding premise. That's essential really to the concept of zone training, because unless you feel that something is different going on in these different zones, there's no point separating training into zones. I hope that's kind of reasonably clear. I stress it because actually it's often overlooked. We split stuff into zones, but we don't necessarily consider why we're doing it. So it's kind of really important to take that premise. Zone training is intrinsically linked with the concept of thresholds. Now, for those of you logged on, if you missed it, if you just logged on, I'm going to talk a lot more about threshold training on the 20th of May, where I've got a separate webinar on it. It's important because threshold training is kind of intrinsically linked to zone training, because physiological thresholds, which I will talk through in a touch more depth in a little bit, often provide the boundaries between training zones. They provide a basis for separating up training zones. And there's a whole load of different threshold terminology that you might have heard of. Fat max, lactate threshold, lactate turn point, max lactate, steady state, VO2, critical power, etc., etc., etc. I will go through that stuff in a lot more depth on the 20th and how to apply it within your training and where maybe not to apply it. But it's important to understand that as we get stuck in some of the data I'm going to show you in a few slides' time, that those physiological thresholds are kind of intrinsically linked to the concept of zone-based training. So if you don't understand them, then it's important to kind of go away and do a little bit of reading around it, and also accept that even the concept of threshold training itself is not universally accepted or agreed by science. So the goal of separating your training into zones is basically to give each of your training sessions some kind of clearer physiological purpose. So each of your runs becomes, you are trying to peg each run or each different interval to some kind of clearer physiological outcome in the mind of the athlete or in your own mind. So it helps to guide or dictates, depending on how you coach, the desired intensity for a session or the desired output for a session. Now, I'm getting into this quite technically, but those things are quite different. So as a coach, let's say I'm a coach and I'm coaching you, if I set my training zones by heart rate or by perceived effort, what I'm doing there is separating the training up to guide you at what intensity I want you to work at. If I set my training zones by pace or perhaps power on the bike, I'm trying to guide you to a goal that I want you, or an output that I want you to achieve. It's important to understand that they're two slightly different processes of setting training and coaching. They're both relevant, they both apply, and you may use them at different times. But they are both sort of different ways of doing things. You've got to think about it as coach. You have to think about how you want to set zones. But however you set them, they will be different with different athletes. So they might look slightly different. They may be framed in a slightly different way, and they will be different across different sports. So how do we go about working them out? Well, first and foremost, you need to sort of decide what measure you're going to use, how you're going to formulate those zones. Are you going to use what we call a measure of internal load, or are you going to use a measure of what we might call external load? So think about internal load as what you would imagine to be like the physiological impact of a particular training session. So if we're setting training zones to internal load, we might use things like heart rate. We might use TRIMP, which is a training impulse. So essentially a method of calculating training load by combining time and heart rate. Or we might use a rate of perceived exertion, your kind of talk test from 0 to 10. But essentially, it's a way of setting training zones to recognize their physiological impact. So it might look something like 3 by 10 minutes in zone 4 that might, for you, roughly correlate with 85% of your maximum heart rate. Whatever, don't get too caught up on the numbers. But we might choose to do it by external load. So we might set it by pace or power. So we might focus on the output of the session. So instead, we might go, I want you to run 3 by 5K at pace zone 3, depending on how you've set your zones. And hopefully, I know I'm getting stuck in some details here, but hopefully you understand that there's a difference there between doing that. So one is internal load, the stress that we're asking our body to do. One is the kind of output, what our body has achieved. And we can set training zones by either of those. So after you've decided which approach is going to work for you, or more importantly, the athlete you're coaching, if you're a coach, we need to do a bit of testing to work out your individual zones. And we can do that in a number of different ways. So we can just go and do a basic maximum heart rate test, which can be done in a range of different ways. So, you know, your watch will take a stab at it. It'll probably be wrong. You can go and run 2 lots of 800 meters, run the first one as hard as you can, take a short recovery, give the second one your best effort. About halfway through, you'll probably hit your max heart rate. So we can do some really crude measurements, taking your maximum heart rate, and then using a series of calculators to work out your heart rate zones underneath that. We can go in a bit more depth and go into lab testing. So we can go to a lab and get a submaximal test or a VO2 as well done, which will help us guide a little bit more specifically what those zones would look like. We can do functional threshold power. So anybody who's used to doing some serious training on a bike will be used to functional threshold power. Anybody who's got a Zwift account with a bike may have even have done one of these tests. So there's different ways that we can test. We can even use a recent race. So if you've ever gone onto like Greg McMillan's kind of calculator, he'll use time from a recent race, similar with Jack Daniels' VDOT calculator as well. And again, these are their tools to sort of guide you around how to set zones using some kind of metric. So we need to do that little bit of testing to work out where you're at. But let's go with heart rate, because I think for most people, when we talk about training zones in running, most people think in terms of heart rate, and that's where most people's kind of mindset is around training zones. So let's give an example of an athlete who's had a lab test. Actually, it's not this athlete, because this athlete's a race walker, but the data I'm about to show you is from an athlete who is a marathon runner. So I've taken this athlete into the lab. They've done a what we call a submaximal test, or effectively a lactate test in the lab, where she has increased her pace in 3-minute blocks. And at the end of each 3-minute block, we've taken some blood from her ear. In fact, I haven't, I've just stood there. The physiologist has taken blood from the athlete's ear, and we've used that to see how her lactate levels are increasing through the course of the session. I'm going to talk about lactate a little bit more in a little bit. This gives us a wide range of data, gives us pace, gives us heart rate, gives us lactate. She's also wearing a mask, which is telling me how much oxygen and carbon dioxide kind of exchange is happening. So with all of that, having gone through that whole process, I can get a whole load of data. And you can see here that the lab in question, which is St Mary's, have actually helped me by kind of guiding me already on some training zones. So they've taken all of this data and they've set here a series of training zones. You can see them down on the bottom, on the table at the bottom: easy, steady, threshold, interval. Don't get too stressed about those terms. Just recognize that there's several different zones there. And those zones, you can see that there's a heart rate applied to them. You can see that there's a treadmill pace, a speed, and you can see that there's a pace. On the right-hand side of the screen is just an extrapolation of if you held that pace for various different race distances. So this athlete, female marathon runner, has gone through this lab test. That's given me a whole load of data that I can then apply back into a training. What you'll have noticed on the slide before, and this is the one slide where I'm going to talk a little bit more about threshold training, or at least a little bit more about threshold, is you'll see two sort of grayed out areas here, which are two physiological thresholds, basically. So the first one, LT, lactate threshold; the second one, LTP, lactate turn point. essentially being two different metabolic thresholds. Now, most of you probably would have heard or be used to the terms aerobic, anaerobic, creatine phosphate, so energy systems, basically. So what we're trying to do here when we're setting training zones is to recognize that as we move through different training intensities, our body is more or less reliant on different energy systems as we go through. And what these thresholds do is kind of try to guide it with a bit more specificity about what is physiologically happening in the body. So they're related to lactate, and you can see here on the screen lactate threshold, and you see that red line, which is the measure of lactate. This athlete's had relatively sort of steady lactate levels as she's increased the pace. They've not increased that quickly, but when she reaches lactate threshold, they've started to increase. And broadly, if we carried on this test for a little bit longer, what we should see around that LTP is that lactate curve starts to increase exponentially, or at least at a significantly higher rate. So, as I said, thresholds and zones are intrinsically linked, because what we end up doing with that is taking these two thresholds and building them in to how we construct our training zones. So they provide some of the boundaries between our training zones. And in this case, they provide a boundary between, if I pull up a picture, between zone, in this picture, between zone 2 and zone 3 and zone 3 and zone 4. More on that in a second. What's really important to recognize here is that when we use terms like threshold, when we use sciencey terms, they're more often than not used incorrectly. And I'm just being completely honest. They're used incorrectly by athletes. They're used incorrectly by coaches who maybe only understand it at a relatively basic level. And I'll put my hands up and say I probably do as well, because I'm not a physiologist. But if you go down to your local track, or if you hear an athlete on TV, the amount of times I've heard this sentence said, I kind of went over lactate threshold and the lactic acid was burning in my legs. There is literally nothing about that sentence that has any foundation in fact. So there is no black and white lactate threshold. And if I've got some physiologists logged in, they may potentially get a little bit upset with me about that, but the research backs it up. There's no defined hard black and white kind of thresholds as that picture shows. And in fact, you may be able to determine that from that picture. In this case, there is a reasonably sharp incline here, but when we get to lactate turn point, there is no real kind of dramatic change. So these are kind of these are things that we construct to help us understand messy biology, basically. So it's really important you understand that, because we use these terms like this black and white, hard science. This is right, this is wrong. That is not the case, and that's really important to understand. And like I said, I was going to raise challenges and questions as we go through this process. So why is that term wrong? Well, frankly, it's wrong on a number of levels. There's no hard and fast lactate threshold. Your body doesn't produce lactic acid. Lactic acid is found in food. Your body doesn't actually produce lactic acid at all, and acid is not what makes your legs burn when you train hard. So there's literally nothing about that sentence that makes any kind of physiological sense. And I was saying, you know, as I started this presentation, I was going to raise more questions than I do answers. Look into this in a little bit more depth, and there's loads written on kind of myths around lactate training and whatever. Lactate is a byproduct of exercise. It's not a waste product. It's a byproduct, and it actually provides a fuel source for our body when we get good at being able to reuse it. Now, energy systems, aerobic, anaerobic, creatine phosphate, they happen on a continuum, particularly aerobic and anaerobic at least, happen on a continuum. It's not you train in this zone and you're training aerobically, you train in this zone and you're training anaerobically. These energy systems work concurrently at the same time, just to varying degrees. And again, really, really important to understand that, because I've read the amount of times I've read people say, this is your aerobic energy system, this is your anaerobic energy system, this is your aerobic zone, this is your anaerobic zone. It doesn't actually play out like that. And it is far more complicated than that, and actually your body works on this kind of continuum. So when we set training zones, we like to divide things up to make it clearer to understand. But please just recognize that in reality, your body doesn't go through these kind of black lines moving from one to the other. It's just a continuum. It's just like a sliding scale. And I'm going to cover lactate, threshold and threshold training in loads more depth on the 20th of May. So go with that, but just recognize that this stuff is complex. So how do we apply this data? So we've got all of this data, we've got this training zone stuff, we've got these heart rates, we've got these paces. From this data, I can choose whether I set training zones, heart rate, pace, threshold pace, whatever. But then I need to decide, well, how many zones do I want? Because if you follow that link, you won't be able to click it. But if you Google it or you type it in, that will take you to Training Peaks, which is like an online training platform. And it will take you to a page that lists all of the different calculators that they built into their website to set training zones. And there's so many different ways to do it. There's people who work off 3 training zones, 5 training zones, 9 training zones. And that's another decision as an athlete or a coach. You need to decide how you use zones, how many you want to work around. And that's right for you and your context. You need to decide what language your athlete wants to use and what they're going to understand and why. And it is possible to, with a goal of making messy biology that is complicated and changes over time more straightforward by putting in these zones, but then make it more complex again by adding in loads of different zones that are hugely complicated using really complicated terms. So for me, like, running isn't that massively a complicated sport particularly. Biology is complicated, absolutely. Performance is complicated. But the act of running and getting fitter isn't that complicated. We can overcomplicate these things. And if you want to have a little look, go through to that link and you'll find 80-20 training, which is actually a really basic, simple concept. And if you look at the training zones that Matt Fitzgerald has set, they're actually quite complicated. So it just shows you can take a pretty simple system and make it overly complicated. But you need to choose how many zones you want. There's no right and wrong to that. But here's the most commonly used approach. 5 training zones, you'll actually see 6 here, but ignore the blue because that doesn't really relate to aerobic or anaerobic energy as such. So 5 different training zones, zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can see along the bottom where those relate roughly to different percentages of your maximum heart rate. Or peak heart rates, and you can see on there along the top as well where those 2 thresholds fall within this kind of typical training zone model. So what does all of that mean? Well, like I said, the whole purpose or the whole principle of splitting training into zones is that we are kind of accepting that different zones have some kind of different physiological adaptation that happens as a result. You know, you train in zone 1, this happens. You train in zone 4, this happens. Because if we don't accept that, don't bother splitting your training into zones because there's no point in doing it. So something different must happen, otherwise why do it? And this is something that England Athletics gave to me a few years ago. They originally only had 5 zones on it, as you can 4 zones on it, as you can see, but I've added a 5th in there, that Z3 sort of, you know, junk miles one, with very controversially called junk miles. I wouldn't have said it is, but it's controversially. I'll pick up that later on. But you can see along the bottom, so training zone 1, we're building capillary density, where our body's working more with stored fat, we're working more aerobically. Our body's getting good at working with oxygen. Our body is building mitochondria. As we say move into zone 4 or zone 5, our body is improving lactate threshold, or it's getting good at reusing lactate as an energy source, or our body in sort of zone 6 on this picture at least is recruiting more fast twitch muscle fibers, so we're able to run quicker. So like I said, the concept of zone training is that something different is happening at each of these different zones. I hope that makes sense. As it then correlates to how you set training, well, this picture is reasonably sort of useful, I think, that if what we're saying is that those higher zones, those harder zones, our body is relying more on anaerobic energy systems, we can't train for as long in those zones. So we need to be more careful around the dosage that we set an athlete or that we set ourselves. And this is kind of this again is a picture that was given to me by England Athletics. We can debate where VO2 max and where lactate threshold sit on this. This is not particularly relevant, but what's relevant, if you look down at that interval training time, you can see that obviously as we move into that zone 4, zone 5 area, we can't hold an athlete there for as long. So we break training up into intervals because we can't sustain it for extended periods of time. So we might work 90-95% of maximum heart rate. So think 5 to 10K type intensity, 2 minutes, 3 minute, 4 minute type blocks, 800s, K reps, 1200s, that sort of stuff. Get down into marathon, so we're kind of sub-threshold now, we might be working 3 by 20 minutes or whatever it is. So we recognize that in different zones, we can drop in a different dosage because we can work for longer periods of time. So I take all of that data that I've got from my lab test, or I've got from a maximum heart rate test, and I can then construct my zones. And this is actually with the athlete that I've just showed you all of the data from. This is me doing that. Actually, with this athlete, I don't set her training to zones, but I've done this just for the purpose of this presentation to kind of give you an idea. So this is on Training Peaks, and in this case, I've chosen to set her training zones set from her threshold heart rate. And you can see it there. I've got zone 1, kind of recovery zone, zone 2, aerobic, zone 4, threshold. Don't worry too much about the terms. But what this allows me to do is to say, look, what I want you to do today is, I'm not interested in what pace you run. I want you to work between this heart rate or this heart rate. I don't even have to say that. I can go, look, today I want you to do, 30 to 45 minutes in zone 2. And that's just really simple. Gives the athlete kind of really simple instructions. It gives them parameters to work around, and particularly in this case, it would stop the athlete from going and pushing too hard on what might be an easy or a recovery one. I could do the same to pace, so because I've got a load of data from that lab test, so I can do the same to pace. So again, here I've set pace zones instead of heart rate zones. Similar kind of idea, based around her threshold pace. So similar idea. And again, it's just a different way that I can program and prescribe training. At the actual individual session level, what might that look like? Well, again, this is Training Peaks, but you can do this written down. You can do this as a text message. You can do this written on a back of a fag pack. It doesn't really matter particularly, but this is how it plays out. So you might go something like, I want you to do 20 minutes in zone 1, building to zone 2, and then I want you to do 10 minutes at zone 4, top end of zone 4. I want you to have a short recovery, 5 minutes at the start of zone 2. Longer recovery, 10 minutes at top of zone 4, shorter recovery, 5 minutes at the beginning of zone 5. So you can see what it's doing is kind of removing, it's like removing paces, removing other variables to just try to kind of simplify things a little bit and just guide the intensity that little bit more. So it can do a range of different things for me as a coach. So what it allows me to do is kind of get more of an overview of training, like a snapshot of training. I can see the distribution of an athlete's training in different zones across long periods of time, like macro cycles of training, mesocycles, or right down to the microcycles of training, or as I've just shown you, the individual session itself. Look at my presentation on periodization if you want a little bit more on that. And like I said, it's going to look different for each individual athlete. How much time you spend in each individual zone depends on you as an individual, and it depends on the event that you're training for. Like I said, I can take that snapshot of the training distribution from an individual session. So I can look at a session and go, X amount of time in this zone, X amount of time in this zone. Yeah, they probably hit what I wanted them to hit. They're probably touching on the efforts that I want them to touch on in order to get the fitness response that I want from that session. Or I can take a bigger period of time and kind of go, well, what is their training load looking like over an extended period of time? How much intensity have they put in? Is it time they had a little cutback? Might look something like this. Yeah, you can kind of, this is not, if we were in the program itself, I could kind of pull up different percentages here. And there's loads of different training applications and programs. So you can just do this yourself with an Excel document. It works perfectly fine. So the benefits, it gives a bit of clarity amongst what is quite a chaotic thing. Biology is chaotic, sport is chaotic, and it can provide a way that you can just frame your training quite quickly and simply. We don't cope well as athletes and coaches with messiness, with uncertainty, with chaos. If you go back and watch my periodization presentation, I would encourage you to embrace chaos sometimes, because that is the reality of the world in which we live. But we like to organize things, we like to categorize things, we like to kind of go, do this, you get this response, put in X, you get Y out, or whatever. So it can kind of help provide a little bit of clarity if you accept that that principle actually takes place, which I'm about to challenge. It can give a shorthand to athletes, so it can be really, it can allow you to do really simple kind of reference points, like, you know, as I've just said, I want you to do whatever, 10 minutes in zone 2, 3 by 10 minutes in zone 4 with a short recovery, 10 minutes in zone 1 to 2, whatever it is. It could just, we can just simplify things. I think that's pretty clear. It can prompt to challenge. It's a prompt to challenge athletes' thinking sometimes. So I think we all know, and I'm absolutely guilty of this myself, I think we all know athletes that probably do their easy running a little bit too hard, and their hard running perhaps sometimes not hard enough because they're too tired or whatever. So, you know, in training zone terminology, is an athlete spending a lot of time around top end of zone 2 into zone 3 and doing a lot of their running around there. So training zones kind of give us the same slide, aren't they? Oh, marvelous. They give us the ability to kind of just almost give athletes like a visual in their mind to kind of go, oh, there's this like area in the middle that if I do a lot of training there, I'm probably not going to get quite the physiological response I want. I'm probably going to be a bit too tired to train hard, but I'm not really going to be stressing my body enough to get the adaptations I should. So I think training zones can be useful. They're like a prompt, if you like, in that way. They can help focus on internal load. If you set them to heart rate, for example, by setting training to training zones, you can complete sessions on completely different surfaces. So you can run over hilly terrains into windy weather. You can maybe be at altitude, although that still requires a bit of consideration in how you set zones. But you're no longer stressing about pace. So you're trying to work with what your body's actually doing, not what you want it to do, if that makes sense. And then even literally the color coding, did you do the right percentage of the session in the right zone, can be positive for some athletes. It can also be very negative for some athletes. So there are psychological implications to doing this. There becomes a bit more of a right and wrong, like a compliance sort of thing going on with your training. But for some people, they like that. For some people, it works for them. That's cool. We need to respect that as coaches, or respect that in itself. That's a repeat of the slide was just done. I'm not quite sure why I did that. But there are challenges, and I'm going to speak for just a few more minutes, and I'm going to open up to questions. So whilst I've just said that one of the real benefits of training zones is that they can simplify the chaos, that is the major downfall, that they oversimplify the chaos of training, and they oversimplify the confusion of training. And the main reason why they do that is what that ends up happening is, if you're not really careful, you can end up setting training solely based around what we call energetics. So solely around the energy system that your body's using, or what percentage of your maximum heart rate you want to work. And we assume that if you go and train in zone 1, you get this really specific adaptation as a result. It's not that simple. That does not happen in that way. So we kind of oversimplify it a little bit. There is far more training. I've seen this a little bit further down the screen. I should put it here, where I've written energetic bias is reductionist. So we've got an energetic bias. We kind of, as running coaches, we really like stuff like heart rate, energy systems, how much percentage of fat we're burning, how much percentage of carbohydrates we're burning. We kind of like energetics, but there's loads more to performance and training than just energetics. What about fueling? What about your ability to take on fuel? What about your neuromuscular system? What about your body's strength and your body's ability to contract muscles quickly? What about sports psychology? So if we get into setting training just around training zones, and just around energetics, we're missing a huge amount of other stuff that will impact on your ability to race well. And that is fundamentally, like, I appreciate we all train for different reasons. For some people, it's health and fitness and all of that. I accept that. But let's say we're taking an athlete, or the athlete I've just shown. If I set her training solely by energetics, by heart rate training zones, when she stands on the start line of the race, I've failed her, because there's a whole load of other variables in her training we haven't addressed. I hope that's kind of clear. Can lead to do metabolic thresholds even exist? I won't get too heavily stuck into that, but I will be next time, so join me on the 20th. compliance culture, it can definitely lead to this way, at least from a coaching point of view, of kind of going, I've set you to do X amount of time in this zone and X amount of time in this zone, and you haven't done that. So you end up being this kind of right and wrong of training. And I think that's something that, if you're kind of into the sociology of training, you need to be a little bit careful around, because we want athletes who are able, within a racing situation, to make their own decisions and to be able to feel their pace and effort, rather than just always relying on measurements to be able to do that. Misunderstood and oversimplified sciencey language makes us coaches sound intelligent, and we're often not, including me. No, it's a joke. That is genuinely a joke. But we need to be careful around the sciencey language we use. So if we're kind of using terms like threshold, what do we actually mean? Because I think sometimes these terms are used in coaching to convince people we know what we're talking about. We need to be kind of careful about how we use them, because we're often not very precise in using them. I would encourage most people to kind of focus more on how what we're actually helping athletes to do. So rather than saying, this session, you're going to do it in zone 1 because it's going to build your capillary density. Like, how do I race better as a result? That's what I'm interested in. How am I going to enjoy my running more as a result, or whatever your goal is? So let's kind of, I think, focus. And sometimes the danger with training zones is we can get too hooked up on the kind of sciencey stuff and forget what actually happens when the gun goes in a race. Because you're not interested in what lactate levels you're at when you're running in a race. You're not interested in what zone you're in when you're in a race. You're interested in what your body can do on that day. And specifically around heart rate, almost there now, you'll be delighted to know, but specifically around heart rate, there are issues with heart rate. And if we take the premise that most people are setting training zones in running to heart rate, we need to understand that has limitations. And I'll show you a couple of examples. So this is an athlete I've got who is doing most of his work on a bike at the moment. So this is a session I've set him on the bike. And you see 3 different lines on this session. This session is 2 by 4 minutes, 8 minutes, 2 by 4 minutes, 8 minutes. That's the session. The red line is heart rate. You can see the red line. Sorry if you're colorblind, this is not an ideal slide for you, but the red line is heart rate that gradually goes up through the session. The green line is pace, and the pink line is power, because you've got a power meter on his bike. I've set the session to output, so I've set the session to power. So I wanted him to kind of do this session to power. But you can see here, if I'd set this to training zones to heart rate, I would have got a very different result out of this training session, more than likely, because you can see what's happened through this session is his power stayed broadly the same. And this actually dipped a little bit at the end, but his power stayed broadly the same, but his heart rate has gradually drifted up through the session. So how do I handle that in terms of training zones? What am I doing? It's important to understand that heart rate is quite sort of laggy in the way that it works. And the next slide, and I do apologize because it will look immediately a bit confusing, but I will explain it to show this lag and how that works. So this is a runner. And there's 3 different, this is one training session, but there's 3 different charts here. The top chart is heart rate, the middle chart is pace, the bottom chart is power. This is power based upon from a wristwatch. I won't go into the validity or non-validity of that in this. That's something for something else. What I want you to look at is the heart rate. So this session was, I can't remember exactly, because it's actually a couple of years ago now, but sort of 8 to 10 minutes at around what we would call zone 4, maximum lactate steady state, whatever terms you want to use, lactate. So for him, about his 10-mile pace. He's then done a series of short hills, 45 to 60 second hard hills. Then he's come back on the flat again to do another block of that 8 to 10 minutes of that sort of tempo work. Now, what the heart rate shows is pretty much similar, right? So if you trace along, you can see he's kind of pushed his heart rate a little bit into the red. Probably shouldn't have done, but anyway, he did. So that's his long block at 8 to 10 minutes. But his 45-second hills, his heart rate hasn't gone much higher than it did on that first block. And on the last block, it's again about the same. But I've added in there a little blue line, and that's his perceived effort. His perceived effort was a load harder on the hills than it was on the tempo work, as it should have been. And what's happened here is that 45 to 60 seconds running hard, whether it's uphill or on the flat, is not enough time for your heart rate to catch up. basically. And then you're taking a break again, so your heart rate goes down. But his perceived effort was much higher, and that's because his muscles are producing a lot of the load, not his, not so much as, I mean, his cardiovascular system was under stress as well, but not as much stress as we were creating from his muscular load. And the heart rate hasn't picked that up. Power has. You're very hard to see on the bottom picture, but power's picked it up. But pace hasn't picked it up at all. So you can see here, what I'm trying to say here is that if we get really stuck on just one or two measurements to set our training zones, we can get ourselves in a real pickle with this sort of stuff. And that's why it's really important that you empower athletes to still just trust how they feel, not just completely dictate to them on pace, heart rate, and the like. You know, we've got to give them a range of tools to work with. And last kind of challenge, and I'm going to open it up for a few questions because actually I don't know that many so far, which is good. Commonly, we would say in zone training, if you're working off 5 zones, it's very often you'll hear that zone 3 is one to avoid. Right, because it's kind of where we do that bus stop running, like a steady state running, pushing our easy runs a bit too hard, and our hard runs probably not hard enough. But if that's a zone we're going to avoid because we don't get a great physiological adaptation from it, if you want to read on that, go and read Stephen Seiler's research. It's completely backed up. You know, it's definitely disputed, but it's still, there's research to back that up, that that may be the case. What about marathon pace? Because for most people, who, if they're kind of running marathons at a reasonable pace, you know, like 2.5, 2 hours, 2.5, 3 hours, 3.5 hours, you're going to be doing your marathon. Your marathon pace isn't easy. You're going to be doing it probably somewhere in that zone 3. So how about that? Because, you know, zone training kind of ideas told us we should avoid this zone, but the athlete's got to go and race at this zone. So what I'm saying is there's other factors to consider. So even if metabolically there's not a great reason for an athlete to go and run marathon pace, there are some coaches that will train athletes to run a marathon to never run at marathon pace, because there's plenty of research to suggest that actually what it does is deaden your adaptation and limit your athlete's ability to develop over time. We will cover that in the threshold one. I will promise you I'll cover that in real depth. But I work with athletes that have also got psychology, and if they hadn't done marathon pace and they hadn't felt that rhythm, that's where they build their self-efficacy. That's where they build their confidence. So I've got to build some of it in there. So what I'm saying is there's far more complex, and I want to know what their fueling's like around marathon pace and whatever. So it's far more complicated than just having these buckets that you drop different zones into, different training into, and you get these different fitness adaptations. We need to be aware of that. So I hope that is of some use. Oh, you're right. Sorry. Yeah, there is this kind of metaphysical thing to training. So 66 years today since Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile. And if you look on my Twitter, I shall leave you with that in a second. I've got a video of Roger Bannister running a 4-minute mile, and he talks it through, and he's talking about his psychology, that his perceived effort was really low, especially early on, really low, but he's running faster than he's ever run before. His perceived effort's really low. And to him, he felt like he was running slowly. So we've got to understand that there's kind of an element of metaphysics in running. Like some days stuff just flows, and you can't drop that. You can't define that by a bucket, you know, like you can't define that by a zone. And so we want athletes to be able to still enjoy their training and not kind of program out that humanity out of it. So join me for the threshold session. You've got to know your athletes. You've got to know what works best for you. Are you somebody that struggles to connect with your own perceived effort? Are you a bus stop runner? Use different tools for different purposes. So you might use different training zones with different athletes, different ways of structuring training zones with different athletes. You might use different training zones and different ways to structure sessions for different sessions. So if it's a recovery run, you might use heart rate. If you want somebody to run at race pace, well, you might want to set some pace zones. So mix it up a little bit. Try not to get too hooked up on one way of doing things. If you do use zones, it's great, but just be aware that it's not black and white. You don't have these black and white intervals between zones. It's continuum. It's a grey scale. And don't forget there are these other considerations: physiology, psychology, mechanics, strength, fueling, heat regulation, all that good stuff. Essentially, you've got to have really good feedback mechanisms between you and your athlete to pick up all of that stuff. So that's my Twitter. Have a little look at it for that picture of that video of Roger Bannister. That's my email address. I may not be able to answer all of your questions now. Helen will be with me for a little under 10 minutes. I can continue to pick up your questions after she's gone. Helen, would you be up for pulling up the first question for me, please? The zone ranges tend to be defined as a percentage of maximum heart rate. How would you calculate maximum heart rate without a lab test? Really good question. So Obviously, there are sort of these quite old school calculations that people used to do, like 220 minus your age. And for a relatively fit and a trained person, you'll probably find that often ends up coming in too low. So there are a lot of different methods you can do. You can calculate what we call your heart rate reserve. So you take your the difference between your resting heart rate and a rough calculation of your maximum heart rate. You can go and do a maximum heart rate test. You might need some encouragement from some friends or family, but you can go run 3 minutes or let's say 800 meters and really give it some real big effort. Take a short recovery, 90 seconds ish, and try and go again. 60, 90 seconds, try and go again. Try to run the second 800 or the second 3 minutes at the same intensity you did the first. Probably halfway through that second block, you're going to reach your maximum heart rate. Don't forget that it's psychologically governed as well, though, so you might need somebody to give you a bit of a push for that, because it's a very hard thing to do. You can do it in hill sessions, but as you saw from the picture that I've just shown, what tends to happen, and when we're working athletes, and I'm going to use some sciencey terms that are kind of physiologically guided terms, which I probably shouldn't, but if we're trying to do a traditional sort of VO2 max development session, so take an athlete to like 90-95% of the maximum heart rate, what we would tend to do is, instead of doing really short intervals like 400s or minute reps, we'd probably hold them there for a little bit longer. We might be doing 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, because that time allows the heart rate to catch up. So that's the reason why we use these slightly longer blocks to try to determine our maximum heart rate. You've got to be working pretty hard. It's pretty painful. So that's a reasonable way to do it. Is there any hills where... right, okay. There's any hills where I live. How can I vary my training and run 5 to 6 times a week? Well, this is an example of where training zones, or at least training to internal load rather than external load, can really help you. Because, I mean, I think actually it'd be great if Helen were answering these questions on this one, because I know for certain one very good athlete that Helen coaches used to do a lot of her easy running, easy in inverted commas, running down on the coastline around Cornwall, so very hilly, and that's when she was running to pace, but actually when you start to look at that, you know, like a 7:30 mile over a very hilly route is a very different physiological prospect to doing that over a flat route. So that's where heart rate becomes quite useful. So for me, I would be looking to do a little bit more heart rate training if I lived in a very hilly area, and I would be really working to try. You have to be really disciplined. It takes putting your ego in a box. I would be looking to do, you know, it's a very rough estimate, but maybe 80% of your training at comfortable intensities. If you're working off zones, and you already tell that I don't do much of it, but if you're working off zones, zone 1 and 2, and maybe 20% zone 4 and 5, and using your heart rate to guide that. Interesting to hear from Diane. Interesting to hear your views on what factors may affect an athlete's ability to increase HR into what would be a zone they regularly training. For example, an athlete trains 130 to 145 for a number of sessions, but occasionally starts a session through whole session is unable to raise to 130. I've concluded it might be linked to inadequate recovery, tired muscles, possible dehydration. Do you have any other suggestions? Yeah, really good. When you start to track heart rate, when you start to track internal load over time, you start to see trends. So one of the reasons why it can be a useful thing to do. Recovery, you can get a sense of that from heart rate, because if you're finding your heart rate is regularly suppressed and you're struggling to get your heart rate up, it can be an indication of either acute or chronic tiredness, depending on where you're at. Heart rate variability is quite a good measure. We're not going to go into that now, but look it up. Heart rate variability is quite a good measure for checking chronic tiredness, but there are other factors that affect heart rate, and you're absolutely right to raise this, because I didn't say this when I was kind of discussing the limitations of heart rate. If you turn up to a session dehydrated, your heart rate is going to be different. It's probably actually going to be probably slightly higher, if anything. Because like if you're dehydrated, your blood plasma levels change, and so your heart rate will change. So we've got to understand that this isn't a defined right and wrong here with heart rates. It will change depending on how you're feeling. Your heart rate will rise if you're stressed, obviously, as well. There are times, sometimes, of course, the athlete hasn't put the heart rate monitor in the right place. So if it's on the wrist, it's not securely fitted, kind of, you know, a centimetre above the wrist bone as it should be, or the heart rate straps come loose and it's just not recording properly. So there are tech kind of issues that get in the way, but I would probably look at recovery. Yeah, the physical stress, maybe inability to generate power in that instance. If an athlete is improving quickly, do you retest in order to move the zones up in pace, or do you just continue to track heart rate? It depends on context. Look, the reality is some of the best runners in the world have never had a lab test. So a lab test isn't essential in order to go and perform. That's why I rely an awful lot on rates of perceived exertion, so RPE, as much as I do heart rate and power and pace. And I use all three of those, I would stress, but I use rates of perceived exertion a lot. The reason why I use rates of perceived exertion a lot is because at 20 miles in a marathon, what I want an athlete to do is to feel good, and that isn't going to come from the pace. I mean, that may be affected by what the pace is showing, but internally, I want them to feel good. I want them to be cued into how they're feeling and be able to relax with a rhythm of doing that. And being able to regulate your own perceived exertion, you'll see in the reference list, Sam Marcora's work. Again, read his work, is really good on that stuff. If an athlete is really progressing very rapidly, sure, regular testing will help you keep, particularly the paces. The heart rates may not change massively, but what you'll probably see is the paces start to increase rapidly for the same heart rate, and the lactate levels may be reducing for the same paces. So it just depends how you kind of structure your training. Yeah, I probably would, but I wouldn't over test. Like, I would trust that if they're improving, they're improving. Your sessions will give you loads of feedback about what right paces are, and get them to race, obviously, if they can, and we're out of lockdown. What training zones do you use during the general specific competition period to prepare a 5 and 10K athletes? Very specific question. If you look at my periodization video, you'll see that there are some elements of training that should remain, I believe, and we're all different in how we do things, I believe should remain in there most of the year round. So I generally don't have like a base period of training where I'd only do easy running. There would be some kind of quality in there. But the issue for me is, let's say with a 5 and 10K athlete, and we are 25 weeks away from competition, so we're working through that general phase of training, I'd still be wanting to work some pure speed there. So I might be doing some really short, what we call like alactate hills, 8 to 10 seconds where they're sprinting, or might even be doing it on a flat. Training zones, at least where it relates to heart rate or kind of metabolic system, that's completely irrelevant. It doesn't fit within any of that. So it's high quality, there's high quality muscular load, but it doesn't really relate to a training zone. So I'd say for those guys, probably like general period of training, they might be doing a little bit more in zone 4. They might be doing a little bit more in sort of zone 1, zone 2, and some of this alactate stuff as well. As we move towards specific competition periods of training, certainly specific periods of training, if you can imagine, we've kind of got like our speedier work and our more endurance work. I'm going to put the hands in the picture. There we go. They're going to converge, right? They're going to kind of converge around that goal 5 to 10K intensity, which might mean for that athlete, as we get into specific period of training, they're going to do perhaps 80-ish% of their work kind of in that zone 1, 2 area, and they're going to do perhaps more like 20% of their work, probably more like in zone 5, which is more specific for a 5 and 10K athlete. Competition period of training means that we're going to reduce the volumes probably a touch for them, but we may be doing more in that kind of speedier area to maintain speed. Again, doesn't necessarily relate to training zone 5. That's why you saw training zone 6 on that presentation. Helen, I know you've got to go soon, so I'm going to pick up just a couple more. Can we trial Training Peaks? Bear with us at England Athletics. We're working on some stuff at the moment. It is a paid for service from a coach, but as an athlete, you can go in and use it. Training Peaks Final Surge. Final Surge is free as an athlete for sure. Have a look at both of them. There's others, Today's Plan, there's other training systems that do very similar sort of things. You can certainly sign up for a free trial with all of them. And we are working on to give you guys some support with that. Lydia, I talked about quarter effort, half, 3/4 effort in base phase. Whilst it seems to me that these essentially perceived efforts, do you have a view on where these efforts would sit in heart rate training zones? Jason, good to see you back training, Jason. This is good. Yeah, it's a tricky one because Lydiard in those kind of foundation phases of training, kind of like the cliche is it's like long, easy running, and it really wasn't. There was a lot of kind of steady running, what might be kind of around zone 2, and there's there's still quality, quicker running. So, you know, strides, even a bit of fartlek. And this is where training zones get very difficult, because that doesn't really correlate to a defined training zone as such. We're asking an athlete to mechanically still be able to run quickly, and their heart rates are going to go up. Their heart rates may go up to sort of what we might call a zone 4 effort, maybe even the bottom end of the zone 5 effort. But that's not what we're really interested in. I think what I'd say is, let's say you're a marathon runner, would I be doing, and I'm like a long period away from competition, would I be doing huge long drags of marathon pace running, sort of zone 3 or zone 4 running for extended periods of time in a sort of Lydiard based phase? No, definitely I wouldn't be. I would be working on those foundations, giving myself time to build that capillary density, to lower heart rate for my easy and steady running, and combining that with a bit of pure speed and a bit of kind of fartlek work to keep in touch with speed. Doesn't relate that tightly to training zones, I wouldn't have said. The faster work, the easier work probably does, zone 1, but definitely some zone 2 stuff if you're working off a 5-zone training model. Question, what are your thoughts on active recovery and intervals as opposed to just stopping? Depends on what you want to get out of the session, quite simply. Helen, if you have to go, please don't worry. I'm going to keep pulling these up for another couple of minutes, and then I shall say goodbye to everybody and leave you my email address. So it completely depends on what you want from the session. So if the more we are active in our recovery, the more the chances we're making our session more of an aerobic focused session. So what do I mean by that? So if I'm going to do a fartlek session, let's say I'm doing something like, I don't know, 10 by 3 minutes strong with a kind of 1 minute steady float recovery. That's quite an aerobic session, because I'm not giving my heart rate the chance to drop too much on my recoveries, which also means I can't actually push that hard on the efforts. If I drop that to 10 by 3 minutes off 90-second static recovery, I can probably give that some pretty hard effort, and that becomes more like, instead of being more like a half marathon 10-mile 10k type speed, I'm probably able to push up to 5k effort. If I'm a bit of a newer to the sport, I may even be able to push to 3k effort, probably more like a 5 to 10k effort. So it just depends on what you want out of it. If you want to focus on speed, give people a chance to recover. So if you're doing active recovery, you're not allowing the heart rates to drop, and you're trying to focus on pure speed, you're probably limiting your ability to do that. That isn't necessarily a problem. It just depends on what you want out of the session. You can do loads of stuff in recoveries, drills. You can do, steady running. You can do easy running. You can be static. You can walk. And it's just thinking, what is the purpose of this session? Is it to develop my aerobic system? In which case, maybe I want to jump to recoveries. Maybe I want to run the recoveries at a steady pace. If I'm a marathon runner and I want to do these like float recoveries, if I'm trying to build speed and I'm a 5k runner, maybe sometimes it's nice to just give your athletes a couple of minutes rest between their k intervals, so they can really lock into that pace that they want to run on race day, because it'll give them confidence and build fitness. It just depends. Right. I'm going to answer one more question because that's all I've got time for. Daniel, I'm going to quickly pick that up because he's asking what is there a link to the webinar? It will be up very soon, so I literally changed that today. Guys, you know what? My time is up. I have to go because because we can only have 2 people on the webinars at a time, and we've got 2 webinars coming up. So if I haven't answered your question, please do email me. Email address is there. I'll be back with you talking about threshold on the 20th, and I'm back next week with Emily Hosker Thornhill talking nutrition on the 14th next week. Emily's also a top athlete herself, so she can answer questions much better than I can, I'm sure. Take it easy, guys. Thank you very much for sticking with me and just bearing with the kind of this and it's confusing and everything else. It's just the way my brain thinks. So take it easy, and we'll catch you.